Hi, everybody. I thought it might be a good idea to review modulations with you, and I thought maybe since we have Heritage Day on Wednesday, this might be the most efficient way to do it. So I'm going to take for granted that everybody understands things like closely related keys and the types of modulations. Actually, maybe I should talk about the different types of modulations. So, I don't know if I can make this any bigger or not. Okay, there we go. So here, we have two different types of modulations. The first is the common chord, and as I say, it is the most frequently encountered. And the second is the phrasal modulation. So in this first example here, which are these two bars, we have a common chord modulation. Here you can see where the pivot chord would be. We'll talk about pivot chords in just a moment, but at least you can see where that happens. Here, in this other example, these two bars, this would be a phrase modulation. Now, a phrase modulation happens when a phrase modulation is sudden. There's no pivot chord. At the end of a phrase, you cadence in one key, and at the beginning of the next phrase, you're suddenly in a completely different key. So those are the two basic types of modulation that we're going to talk about for a little while in this class. So a common chord, you have a chord that is existing in two keys, here A, and then we exist in E, and then the phrase modulation where there is no common chord necessarily, and the piece ends a phrase in one key and begins a next phrase in another key. Okay? All right, so let's talk about some actual music. So this was the first example we looked at. I think everybody will agree with me that we start in C. Typically in common practice music, we're going to begin and end pieces in C. Now, it's not necessarily the case here because we're showing an example of modulation, but if you're actually looking at a piece by Bach, for example, which we'll look at a little bit later, you'll find that most of the pieces begin and end in the same key. Okay, so we begin in C. The first chord would be 1. The next thing I do is I look for a cadence point. Now, when we talk about these Bach chorales, a really easy way to figure out the cadence point is just to look for the fermatas. Now, as a point of music history, remember that these are editorial. Bach did not write in these fermatas, but nevertheless, they help us understand where the cadences are. Now, in these two bars, I don't see any chromaticism whatsoever. So I'm going to assume that when we cadence here, on beat 3 in the second bar, that we're going to still be in C, and in fact we are. So since this is a 5 chord, as you can see G, B, D, we're going to label that 5 in the key of C. No big deal, right? The first chromaticism that we see happens right here on the and of 1, if you can see that F sharp. Now the G, which is tied over from the bar before, is actually a suspension. So the chord tones are F sharp, A, and C. Now obviously F sharp, A, and C are not diatonic to the key of C. They are diatonic, however, to a key that is closely related to C, that is within one sharp or one flat, and that would be G. So I'll tell you right off the bat, my first instinct would be that we're going to go to the key of C, or excuse me, G. And as you can see here, we in fact do. This is a G chord as well as this chord, and if you look at one before this, we have 5. So we have 5-1 authentic cadence in the key of G. Now we have to determine whether it's a common chord modulation or phrasal modulation. Now, to be honest, the most important thing is understanding what key we're going to and how we got there. But it is also important to understand whether it's phrasal or common chord modulation. So, right off the bat, we can see that the phrase ends in C and then it begins another phrase. Now, we could say that this chord right here on beat 4 of the second bar is 5 in the key of C. It certainly would be, G, B, D. But because we know where we're headed, which is to the key of G, we could also interpret that as 1 instead of 5. So in this case, it would be 1. Then we have F sharp A C, which is 7. Then 7, 6. And then we have C. That actually is a misprint. It should be G and a B. So that would be 1, on beat 2. Okay, let's look at another example. Here again, we're starting in the key of G. I'm looking at example 2. Come on. Okay, well, we're in the key of G. We start on a 1 chord. And remember, the first question I asked myself is, where do we cadence? In what key do we cadence? So here's the cadence point. I think that's pretty obvious. And we have a C, an E, and a G. Now, the chances of us cadencing on a 4 chord, because C, E, G would be 4 in the key of G, is pretty low, especially with the music of Bach, and that's who we're talking about here. So there's a good chance that we modulate it. If we look at the second bar, this is the first instance of chromaticism that we see. F, A, C. Now we also have an E there as well, which could be acting as a chord 7th. But this is the first instance of chromaticism. Given the fact that we're only looking at closely related keys, so in other words, the only options that we have when we start in the key of G are E minor, in which case we'd have an F sharp. We also have C major, in which case we'd have an F natural. We have A minor, in which case we would see G sharps. And we have D major, in which case we'd see C sharps, or B minor, in which case we'd see A sharps, because A sharp is leading tone to B. So the only one of those possible keys that this fits, really, is C. So we could label this as 1. If we label this chord on beat 3 as 1, then this chord would be 5 in the key of C. And then the chord on the downbeat would be 4. Now, since this happens mid-phrase, we know we're looking for a pivot chord. So here's the first instance of chromaticism, right here. Back up 1 chord. We have an E, a C, and a G. The D is another example of a suspension. So since we have a C, E, G, that would be 4/6 in the key of G and 1/6 in the key of C. So here we ended in the key of C. Then we have GBD. We have that G major chord happening again. So I'm going to do my little system again. I'm going to look at where we cadence. Okay, we cadence, it looks to me like in the key of G. G, B, D. And here we have 5/7 in the key of G. D, F sharp, A, C. So this is definitely 5/1 in the key of G. There's no chromaticism, so I think this would be best understood as a phrasal modulation. In other words, there's not really a common chord. We are beginning and ending in the key of G, coming from the key of C here. All right, let's go on. So we're starting in the key of G on this beat, G, B, D, but we have some chromaticism. Let's see where we end. Where do we cadence? Looks like D, F sharp, A. Okay? So if that's a 1 chord, we would be going to the key of D. The first question I'd ask myself is D a closely related key to G? And the answer, of course, is yes. So if this is in fact in the key of D major, I would expect to see 5 or 5/7 on the beat before. 5 in the key of D is A, C sharp, E, and here we have the 7th G. A, C sharp, E. Excuse me, that actually would be, I'm just looking at this chord, I got confused. Beat 2 here, we would have C sharp, E, G, which is essentially functioning the same. It's 7/1 instead of 5. Okay, which would make sense because the 7th, which is actually what gave it away. If you look, if it were actually 5, A, C sharp, E, G, we'd have a 7th going up, and he would have doubled the 7th. And I looked at that, and I'm like, there's no way that Bach would have done that, so it can't be 7, or it can't be 5/7. Okay, but anyway, so we're cadencing in the key of D, 7/1. That's a firm cadence. So I look for my first instance of chromaticism. So since we started over here, the first instance of chromaticism is actually right here. B, D sharp, F sharp. Okay? Now, remember, not every bit of chromaticism is going to indicate a modulation. We still have to think about secondary dominants. So, B, D sharp, F sharp is a major chord that is not diatonic to any of the keys that we're in. Okay? So, actually what Bach is doing is he's doing a secondary dominant. So this would be 5 of E. E in the key of G is 6. So this would be 5 of 6 going to 6. Okay, he just hints at this E minor chord, but we don't stay there long because as we just said, we cadence in D. Here is the next instance of chromaticism. A, C sharp, E, G. Okay, now we know that that could be 5 in the key of D, and it is. So since this is the instance of chromaticism, we're going to back up one chord and see what this chord is. Here we have E, G, B, D. Okay, so this is the 6 of the 5 of 6. E, G, B, D, if you want to count the 7th, that's fine, would be a 6-7 chord in the key of G, or a 2-7 in the key of D. So this is our pivot chord. And it actually makes sense from a Roman numeral standpoint. 2-7, 5-7, 1-6, 7, 1 in the key of D. Okay? Last little bit here and we'll finish up. So we've just ended in the key of D. Now I'm going to look for my next cadence. Here is my next cadence. G, B, D. Now, as I said before, we typically begin and end in the same key. So, that's what is happening here. But we just left the key of D. Now we have B, D sharp, F sharp. Same chord as we had here, just only in a different inversion. It's also going to an E minor chord. So really we have the exact same thing. 5, 6 of 6, going to 6. Or in this case, going to 2, because we're in the key of D still. Okay? So what Bach does essentially is, since we're in the key of D, all he does is he prevents us from hearing any C sharps. So if you look here, this would be 5 of 2, going to 2, but it's also reinterpreted back to 6, because E, G, B is 2 in the key of D, but it's also 6 in the key of C. So we would have 6, then we have C, E, G, which is 4, G, B, D, which is 1. So we're firmly back in the key of G. Okay? So just to wrap it up, we want to understand what key we start in and what key we end in within a cadence. Then you want to find the chromaticism. Where is that happening? Do you feel like that it's actually cadencing in this new key? In this example, it would. This is an actual modulation. Go back to the chromaticism, back up one chord, and you'll find the pivot chord. This is the chord that is existing in 2 keys at the same time. Here, this chord would be 6 in the key of C and 2 in the key of G. After we pivot, we analyze in that new key until the end of the phrase. Thanks. I hope this helps you, and let me know if it does.